There's a paradox that's often forgotten. The United States' share of the global economy has actually grown over the last 5 years. Its tech giants rule the world. Its culture reaches the whole planet, even where dictators try to put up firewalls. So is this the best its democracy can do? In these volatile times, the citizens in the United States have the choice between two aging men, one who stands charged with trying to overturn the will of the people through insurrection, and yet who's leading in the polls, the other whose fitness for 4 more years is doubted by many within his own camp. We'll ask about Joe Biden's insistence on staying in the race and why it's proving so hard to contemplate alternate scenarios. Is it really too late? The last time, millions followed Donald Trump when he made good on his threat to challenge the result if he lost. What further erosion of trust in government? Here in France, snap elections with no clear winner are also testing institutions. Why do politics seem broken at times on both sides of the Atlantic? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking, is a repeat of Biden-Trump really the only choice? Joining us from Washington, a political consultant, Christian Hanley. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me.
From New York City, sociologist Gregory Smith-Simon, professor at Brooklyn College. Thanks for joining us.
Good to see you, Francois.
In a previous life, she was a DC correspondent. Laure Mondeville, senior correspondent for French daily newspaper Le Figaro. Thanks for being with us.
Hello, Francois. Nice to be with you.
Nice to be with you. Olivier Burtin, associate professor in U.S. history and civilization at the Université de Picardie. That's in Emmanuel Macron's hometown of Amiens. You're the author of A Nation of Veterans, War, Citizenship, and the Welfare State in Modern America. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Your reactions on the hashtag F24debate. By the way, both candidates seem old, in case you're wondering. So say registered voters interviewed by the Ipsos polling agency for ABC News. Biden's numbers look bad on this graph, but nearly 2/3 feel the same about his rival. Here's the question, Christian Hanley, that everybody on this side of the Atlantic asks. Why was there virtually no contest in the primaries? Why is it down to this choice?
Well, there was virtually no contest during the primaries because Joe Biden's the incumbent president. So really, ever since the late 1960s, especially on the Democratic side, there hasn't been a lot of examples of incumbent presidents being challenged from within their own party during the primary process. The one example being Kennedy against Carter, but that did not go so well, as we all know. So it's sort of become one part process, one part tradition. There's no rule that says that it could not have gone a different way. The challenge is that right now, that process has run its course. We are now in July, and it seems as though these candidates are now set. And so it's not as straightforward a system as in other unitary countries where federation, and there are different primary elections in all the different states, as well as different general elections, all in the different states as well. And so it's not something that can be changed. A change in course cannot be done on a dime, as it were.
Can't be done on a dime, Gregory Smith-Simon. It's just the way it's always been, and that's the way it is. They start picking the Iowa caucuses are in January, and it lasts all the way till November. Here, we just had an election in 3 weeks with a whole campaign wrapped up. 2 rounds.
There was a time when the decisions were really made in smoke-filled rooms in the convention. We're proud that the primary elections have more power, and the party has built in ways to make sure that those votes count. We're now in an unusual situation where that very process of making the primary votes the real way that a candidate gets chosen is going to impede the party if it decides that it wants to do something else. There's an important question about whether Biden is still, as he was the last election, the person to defeat Trump. But it's going to be difficult to make a new selection look legitimate, both to voters and to the Trump campaign, which is going to assail whoever shows up insisting that they don't have the right to be the candidate.
Insisting they don't have the right to be the candidate. Lots of reaction on the hashtag F24debate, including from Matthew on Twitter, who writes, "Boomers can't give up power, and they control both parties. That's why you have this. That's why you have this choice of Trump versus Biden." Laure Mondeville, I suppose you've been getting a lot of questions about why there was no alternative.
Yes, I think the situation is actually very different on both sides of the politics, because I think that Trump was pushed forward because he has in some ways totally hijacked and is now controlling the Republican Party. And it's a very different situation on the Democratic side. I think on the Democratic side, you have a party which is deeply divided and undergoing an existential crisis. And the only thing that cemented the Democratic Party at this point was actually the fear of Trump. And the problem is that Biden was supposed to be a one-term president who would be a kind of bridge between two periods. And now he's running again as the incumbent president. And this huge doubt has appeared that he's capable of being, the sort of dam that can stop Trump from coming back to power. So that's why you have such an incredible crisis, now. It's because the Democratic Party is in a total state of panic. They understand that Trump is not up to the task physically and mentally, and that they're going to have to look for another candidate in a sort of total crazy hurry, where time is of the essence.
Yeah, there are wagons circling around the White House. George Clooney's opinion piece in the New York Times calling on Biden to quit. Well, it does matter. The Hollywood actor has orchestrated for all recent Democratic presidential candidates huge fundraising drives for the second time since that disastrous debate performance by Biden 2 weeks ago. The former House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, tactfully turning up the heat on Biden.
Up to the president to decide if he is going to run. We're all encouraging him to make that decision because time is running short.
Very tactful, Olivier Burtin. Can Biden stay in the race?
He can. It's going to be harder as time goes by. Essentially, if he decides to sort of withdraw after the convention, which is going to take place in mid-August, that's going to be very complicated. What's going to happen if he does is probably the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, will have to convene and basically appoint somebody to replace him. It's never been done before, and it would probably give rise to several legal challenges. So it could happen, but it's obviously not the ideal solution for anyone there.
Before we look into the possible scenarios, Christian Hanley, you want to react to what Laure Mondeville said about the Democratic, the Republican Party being united behind Donald Trump and the Democratic Party being in disarray?
Yeah, and thank you. I would have to, respectfully push back a little bit on that. Typically, and it's a very common narrative in American media that Democrats are neurotic and fear-driven and are always kind of overthinking themselves into defeat and divided along ideological lines. That's not what we're seeing here. What we're seeing here is genuine concern about perception on the part of everyday voters, whether they are Democratic voters or swing voters, because the performance of Joe Biden on the Thursday debate, as well as in subsequent TV appearances, it wasn't just that they were not great performances. It actually gave credence, unfortunately, to this line of attack from the other side that he is somehow not fit to continue politically, whether in the White House or in this campaign. And so it would be disingenuous to say that we could not have an open conversation about this, at least in the days following that debate appearance. Now, going forward, if he decides to continue this sort of defiant approach and stay in the race, we're going to have to unify behind our candidate, of course. But given what has happened in recent days, it's only natural to have these sort of conversations.
And I want to ask you, can you explain for people outside of the United States why we've seen the progressive wing of the party sticking with the incumbent? The loudest noises for him to go are not coming from the likes of Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders or New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They've reiterated their support.
Well, and AOC, as we call her on this side of the pond, she actually shut down that conversation. The last time I heard her asked by reporters, she said it was the end of the conversation, that he is our candidate and she's sticking by him. Honestly, I'm not surprised by this, though. We've seen throughout the entire administration that the most progressive members of the House especially have stood by Biden. Whether we're talking about things like the Infrastructure Reduction Act or any other piece of legislation, the fear was always that the more liberal wing would be kind of the rabble-rousers. That's sort of the narrative. But what we saw was that it was people like Joe Manchin in the Senate who were pushing against Joe Biden, and the most progressive members of the House and Senate were standing by him. So this seems to be a continuation of that trend where progressives are acutely aware of what the risks are should we lose to Donald Trump in the next election, and they're standing by their candidate, our candidate.
Gregory Smith-Simon, is this how you read it?
I think that the rise of a progressive wing of the Democrats with the prominence that they have now is really historic. And one of the ways they've done it is by being principled, but also being strategic. And they're aware that they need to challenge the mainstream of the Democratic Party about substantive issues. They're smart enough to not do it at a moment where there's nothing for them to gain. The decision about whether Biden stays in the race or not is not going to be made by Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And so they're sitting it out in that way. There are issues that are important to them that they may challenge the center of the Democratic Party on. There's not a reason for them to get involved here, which would also just feed the sense that there's more divisiveness than there are. If you listen carefully to everyone's comments, even the people who are saying Biden is our candidate and we support him, clearly leave open the possibility that if he were not their candidate, they would support the new person running in his place.
And your thoughts on the White House billing it, and this is a quote, this press conference as a big boy press conference. The fact that he trumpeting the fact that the President of the United States will be speaking without a prompter.
I appreciate what they're trying to do. It's certainly clear that people who already understand the stakes as not between two individuals, but two views of democracy, will vote for Biden under any circumstances. But the election in the U.S. is going to come down to the choices of a small number of swing voters in a small number of swing states. Their efforts are laudable, but I'm not sure they're going to be successful. The larger question is, if the people in the party who are arguing that another candidate would be a better challenger, more effective challenger to Trump, are to prevail, the question is what that's going to do to the party. In one obvious way, Kamala Harris is the number two. If you saw a lot of people in the social media landscape sort of leapfrog over her and run to some prospective governors, that has the potential of being really divisive, in particular because voters of color, who are the core of reliable Democratic voters, don't expect to be overlooked that way. So there's the question of what the Biden camp is doing, but then there's the question of how this decision will get made and what it might do to the party if it's not done well.
4 years ago, it was the endorsement of the influential African-American Congressman Jim Clyburn that turbocharged Biden's candidacy and sent him on the way to the nomination. The South Carolina lawmaker, still on script a couple of days back when he was doorstepped by reporters in Washington.
We are riding with Biden.
Was there conversation about Vice President?
We are riding with Biden.
Was there conversation about Vice President Kamala Harris in there?
We are riding with Biden.
Did you get the message there, Olivier Burtin?
I think it was pretty clear. Yeah.
What do you make of that?
I mean, I think it's a problem of collective action. Who begins to sort of call on him to step down and withdraw from the race when that person is likely to be the one who's going to face the most fallout and pushback? When people like Pelosi and perhaps Schumer have now begun to sort of push a little bit harder, when that effort comes from the leadership, then probably the sort of rank and file will follow, but it's a very slow process because also Biden is someone who's liked quite universally, I think, among the Democratic Party. So no one really hates him. He's also running on a good record economically. So it's hard to find people who sort of feel really committed to making him lose, I think.
Laure Montville, the Axios news site reporting that the Senate Majority Leader, Charles Schumer, is privately telling donors that, yeah, he's open to finding an alternate scenario. Listening to our conversation here, what do you make of it? It's the moderates, not the progressives, that are urging Biden to go.
It seems to me that what Ruth said was quite right, that, it's not in the interest of the progressive at this point to come out, and they are not so close to Biden. I think the people who are seeing the depth of this crisis are the ones who are close to him. And it's I think no coincidence that Clooney came out after he organized a fundraising meeting with a fundraising evening with Biden. I think that the people are close to Biden, probably, and it sort of permeates from all the quotes and articles we are reading. Know that the president has huge problems and that he should actually take the courageous decision to get out. I think they are actually sorry. I think they are in fact all aware that they are in absolute stormy weather because there is no good solution. It's very difficult to quit at this point. It's difficult to find replacement. There is the problem of Kamala Harris that was just explained, that they know that she's a weak candidate and that she has no strong popularity. They have a lot of question about her, but she is a Black woman, and that's an absolutely key electorate. So this is going to be, I think, an extremely difficult situation for the Democratic Party in the coming weeks. But at the same time, I was in the U.S. very recently, and I was struck just before the debate, actually. And the people, people who would, usually vote a Democrat, were all mentioning the question about the mental state of Joe Biden before the debate. So I think that's a question that is going to be extremely present on the mind of the people, and could definitely, if they don't tackle this question, could benefit his opponent.
Christian Hanley, is the U.S. president fit to continue for 4 more years?
I mean, I'll be honest, I don't have the firsthand information of being part of Biden's inner.
For instance, I asked that question. I remember reading a column last Sunday in the New York Times by Maureen Dowd, where she described how the White House correspondent for the paper puts on the headset when they're on Air Force One because Biden's voice now is so low that he can't hear what he's saying.
Yeah, I mean, that's been a concern watching his televised appearances. That was true of the debate. It's also true of his follow-up interview on ABC News with George Stephanopoulos. His voice, he didn't have that strength behind his voice. The problem we have, though, is one of perception in many regards, because on the one hand, there's a track record here that speaks for itself, but of course, the average voter is not up to speed with the legislative track record of the administration. On the other hand, though, we have these televised appearances showing this weakened, hoarse voice, his problem recalling certain details, his problem sticking to a certain train of thought. And so that is the public perception is now. We're seeing that in the numbers as well since then. So it's hard to reconcile. It's really that uncertainty and that cognitive dissonance that everyone is grappling with right now, because there is this jarring juxtaposition between a stellar track record and more recent appearances that seem to point to the fact that there could be some degeneration here.
Yeah, just to remind our viewers, you have the primaries that ended on June 30th. You have the third week of August, the Democratic Party's convention, where the delegates that are right now pledged to Joe Biden, under normal circumstances, will make it a formality nominating him. No candidate since the primary system began has ever bowed out after sealing the nomination. What would the alternatives be? Charlie James takes a look.
President Biden has repeatedly said he won't withdraw.
I'm staying in the race.
But the calls to step aside aren't going away, and neither is speculation over who could potentially step in. Vice President Kamala Harris is by far best positioned. She's already on the presidential ticket and would likely control a huge campaign fund collected by Biden. Harris would be Biden's most natural endorsement, and she has a deep roster of supporters.
I think the vice president would be a phenomenal president. I think she has the experience, the judgment, the leadership ability to be an extraordinary president.
Naturally, Harris is currently standing by her running mate.
Joe Biden is our nominee. We beat Trump once, and we're going to beat him again, period.
Biden endorsing Harris could limit potential chaos, but there are questions over whether voters would find this option fair. If the field was opened to additional challengers, there are two names getting the most attention. California Governor Gavin Newsom, he's a highly visible Biden surrogate, often seen defending the president in TV interviews and in battleground states. And also Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. She's a popular politician in a must-win swing state and considered a star in the Democratic Party. These candidates have risks and rewards.
If you look at some polling on some of the other alternatives that have been mentioned, Gretchen Whitmer, Gavin Newsom, they have less negatives, but they're less known.
Both Newsom and Whitmer have said they wouldn't run in 2024, even if Biden stands down.
Less negatives, but less known. Olivier Burtin, again, you and I have just been digesting, again, this sprint of a campaign here in France. We had 2 rounds of voting, a snap election, all happened within 1 month. And, you know, new names emerged that have become household names. Now, granted, the French are politics junkies. You can't compare the two countries. But is it really that difficult to get name recognition out there?
Yeah, I mean, it's the window for someone to actually get on the ballot is actually closing quite quickly. The DNC convention is coming up, but the early voting and mail-in voting is going to start in early September. So for someone to actually get on the ballot in different states, basically has to happen in the next few weeks. And that's basically impossible to do if Biden doesn't step down or withdraw from the race. And
whoever runs, isn't it going to be, in any case, a referendum for or against the return of Donald Trump?
Yeah, but the problem is that he's more popular than he was in 2020. So
how?
You know, there's always a phenomenon where you leave power, you tend to become more popular. We've seen that in former presidents in France as well. People tend to forget what it was like in 2020 or 2019 in the middle of chaos, you know, riots, the COVID pandemic. It's kind of further back in people's memory now than it used to be at the time. So Trump has an opportunity that he didn't have at the time, I think.
Do you think if a similar scenario arrived here in France, the French voters would forget a January 6th type event?
The problem is that we don't really have the same election system as in the US. In France, we have a system that tends to exclude the far right from sort of office and power. Whereas in the United States, because you have 2 parties, but those parties are sort of big tent parties that once you sort of get into them, it becomes easier to wield power. Trump is able to use that different electoral system to reach electoral office in a way that wouldn't really be possible in France because of the nature of our own system.
Gregory Smith-Simon, in 2020, Donald Trump won more than 75 million votes. He didn't lose by a lot. But after January 6th, did you think he was history?
It was hard to imagine that he was going to have the return that he did. And I'll say, you know, you can go back through old YouTube clips and see interviews of him in the 1980s and 1990s. It's actually striking how his cognitive prowess has declined over the decades. You know, now all he can really do is call people names. He used to be able to speak in detailed sentences. I think that, you know, comparing to the French system, we are a little bit in an election where the Democratic voters want to faire barrage. The challenge is, to switch metaphors, we're trying to get someplace and drive really, really fast. And at the same time, there's a discussion about how to check the GPS for the best route. it's really hard to do both of those at the same time. And so the question is going to be how that question gets resolved. I think that, Biden is able to be president. The question is whether he's able to win the presidency the way that he did so impressively, actually, in the last election.
It calls for a different Democratic nominee, have Donald Trump honing his message. The Republican leader who we can show you here at a rally in Florida. He spoke on Wednesday in the company of surrogate Marco Rubio, a former rival in 2020. And Trump employed a version of Stop the Steal that extends to Democratic voters.
But they're lying in the entire world of Joe Biden's condition. I mean, you see his condition. You see them frantically trying to overturn the results of 50 state primaries and install a new candidate at the behest of their very rich donors.
So, Gregory, is that a man who's happy that the Democrats could potentially, in some scenario, change their candidate, or nervous about it?
Trump is good at throwing the same kind of invective at any target, but I think it would set him back if all the time he had invested in going after Biden was for naught. There are ways that a new candidate would be able to evade that. He's going to make those sorts of comments, but I don't think that they're going to be that they're going to hit home in the same way that the ones that he's been honing on Biden for so long have started to do. So I suspect that he would see it as easier to continue in the race with Biden. He's ahead. It's a known quantity. His lines of attack are pretty well set. Someone new would be a very different thing to challenge. And as hard as it would be for the Democrats to get momentum behind somebody who is not the incumbent president, it's going to be hard for Trump to figure it out. If you look at his attacks on Kamala, they've been pretty superficial. He hasn't figured out what to say about her yet. That might give the Democrats some time to run to the front.
Christian Hanley, you agree?
Completely, with just about every single word that Gregory just said. I mean, the struggle for Trump would be to be able to put a different candidate in a box. And he's invested so much time in this narrative of Sleepy Joe or Joe Biden in cognitive decline. Never mind the fact that it is also true that anyone can go back and check interviews going back to the 70s, 80s, and 90s of Donald Trump and see how he's gone from these long, even normal sentences all the way down to just being able to kind of shout insults and slurs and lose his train of thought mid-sentence. Everything he does, Trump, really is projection. When he talks about Democrats, quote unquote, stealing an election, that's because it's exactly what he tried to do in the last election. When he talks about Joe Biden's alleged decline, we can see him declining as well in front of our own eyes. The problem is we're not two different sides of the same coin right now in American politics. Democrats are going to have these conversations and be concerned and think about, okay, what is the most strategic way? How can we best guarantee our chances of defeating Donald Trump at the ballot box? On the Republican side, they're simply going to follow Donald Trump. And that's why he can forget what he's saying. He can lose his train of thought. He can make all sorts of lies and gaffes, and no one really seems to move on him at all on the Republican side because they're all in for their guy, and the facts simply do not penetrate that right-wing media ecosystem.
Laure Mondeville, is this the America that you knew when you were a Washington correspondent?
Well, I think, it has been the process, the sort of the birth of the Trump rebellion and the, also a kind of radicalization, ideological radicalization that we saw happening on the left side of the political spectrum. These were present when I was there, but I would say it all sort of started to coagulate and coalesce around 2010 after the 2008 huge economic crisis, which sort of, I think put a huge questioning among the population about what the elites were up to, how they treated them, the sort of rift between Wall Street and the Main Street that we saw on both the right and the Tea Parties, and on the left, the Occupy Wall Street movement. So these things sort of grew and grew, and I think and exploded in our face. I think in 2015, and actually on both sides we saw this huge rebellion. The Trump one, we saw Bernie Sanders, going very far and very high, being very popular, and then sort of I would say marginalized by the the leadership, the establishment of the Democratic Party. And that didn't happen on the right, where Trump was able to actually hijack, as I said before, the Republican Party. So what's going on now is that...
sorry to interrupt you. It sounds like, from what you're saying, the outlier in this trend isn't Donald Trump being in the lead. It's the fact that Joe Biden was able to win in 2020.
The outlier, Joe Biden was supposed to be a sort of wall against this populist rebellion, but he managed to achieve a certain numbers of reforms that were supposed to actually absorb this sort of rebellion of a middle class. But I think that this rebellion was not only economic, and it was deeply cultural. And in that sense, that's I think the place where he was absolutely unable. He embraced actually the sort of very extreme left agenda, which sort of overwhelmed the Americans' institutions. Not only the universities, but in many instances, companies, political institutions, and also the part of the media, etc. And I think that actually created the big potential pushback from the right, and that actually a lot of people, also because of some also economic policies, the big inflation, that's what people keep repeating, that they want Trump to come back because he's better at economics. And but I would say that he was suddenly after there was the beginning of the judicial process against him. He managed to coalesce. People saw him as a sort of a scapegoat that they had to protect in some ways that from the establishment, and they again gravitated towards him and gathered around him. And I was very struck, when I was in the US, that when you look at the polls and the polling, what is very striking is, first, the national polling is favorable to Trump, which is an absolute revolution if we compare to 2020, where Joe Biden was ahead by a significant, I would say, 6-7% and now he's lagging behind on 1-2%. And second, the polling is very interesting. In the swing states, Trump has been persistently ahead in most of these swing states, and he's getting a larger and larger intention of votes. I don't know if it will become a reality, but among the Latinos, and even a significant part of the Black vote, that's in very different polls. And that's, I think, very interesting, because it shows that the Democratic Party has a problem here that he has to look at, that this sort of very racialist identity politics approach that they used has not worked well. And even among minorities, there are big questions about this obsession with identity.
Gregory Smith-Simon, you agree that it's also about culture, not just about the economy, and that there's a rage against elites in the establishment?
Well, I think that rage against the elites and the establishment takes a particular shape. We're talking about this debate about how the Democrats are going to choose at this late date who their candidate is. In some ways, this may be the last time we have a debate in which we expect the gatekeepers of a party, the organizations and the institutions, to be doing the choosing. Social media has changed the way we choose pop stars. It's changed the way we choose culture and viral hits. it's changing the way globally that we choose political candidates. And I think that the way that Trump bypassed all the traditional Republican institutions and gates to take the lead the last time around, I would expect that the next candidate 4 years from now for the Democrats is going to be someone with an effective social media presence and following there, more than someone who goes through the support of the editorial boards of newspapers, the local Democratic parties, unions and other organizations.
And what will be the message?
That's not necessarily a better way to do it.
What will be the message of that social media star?
Well, I think that unfortunately, social media is structured in a way now that it favors really short, really simple arguments that don't have a lot behind them. I'm not sure that it's the best way. I think it's actually a really dangerous way to choose a candidate. It'll be interesting to see what happens at the level of congressional and senatorial elections moving forward. We're at risk of seeing those see Republican gains in the next election. If the presidential part of the ticket at the front doesn't go well, we'll probably see more and more social media there. I wouldn't call it polarization, but it's certainly a difference in the way that we choose our candidates. And I don't think that that's going away here or anywhere else.
Olivier Burtin?
I would just perhaps just give a word of caution. If you look at Trump's record in sort of elections since he came to the White House in 2017, it's actually quite bad. He lost the midterms in 2018. Obviously, he lost the 2020 election. The 2022 midterms were also sort of a better performance for Democrats than expected. So perhaps we shouldn't write the Democrats out too early. And remember that when comes time to sort of vote in early November, there's usually a shift in public opinion and people tend to remember, okay, this is Trump, this is what he did, and perhaps it's not good.
So the independents will matter come November, is what you're saying.
Well, if he was able to do better this time, this would be sort of not in line with his actual record, is what I'm saying. Is he actually has a pretty poor record of helping his party win elections.
And what about what Laure Mondeville said about how there's been this long arc that you can trace back to the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, where it's fueled this insurgent rage?
Definitely, you have it on the right and on the left. On the right, you had the Tea Party movement. On the left, you had Occupy Wall Street. Bernie Sanders sort of came out of that. It's not over. The economy is doing better, but you still have social and income inequality at pretty sort of sky-high levels. So Trump is riding on that. And if you look at Biden's sort of speech and his discourse responding to criticism that he should step down and withdraw, he's also playing on that same populist discourse, attacking the people who criticize him as elites, out of touch, sort of New York Times establishment figures, whereas he would be representing the sort of working class, middle class America that sort of knows common sense.
So what would Christian Hanley's AI-generated perfect Democratic candidate for 2024 look like?
Oh my gosh, not to put me on the spot or anything. Well, honestly, 4 years ago, I would have said Joe Biden, not just because he was 4 years younger, but because that really was sort of the thinking behind his nomination was he would serve as that bridge candidate. He would show that Democrats were not just the most progressive among the party, but a broad coalition. He in many ways represented that sort of more traditional working class Democratic voter, more of a sort of a traditional JFK Kennedy voter. He was Irish Catholic, blue collar background from Pennsylvania. He really sort of did fit that mold, strong ties to organized labor. That really was his calling card in 2020. And it was not written in the stars that he would not still fill that role in 2024. There was always this talk that he would be a one-term candidate. I don't believe he ever explicitly said that, but he very much implied that in the last go-around. And right now, like I was saying before, the real problem is perception, and that no one can really square his successes in the White House with his poor performance on the campaign trail right now. One thing I would like to take a step back to is the issue of social media, because that's something we are not talking about nearly enough right now. Because one thing that is very clear is that the Trump voters they're not watching informed debate such as this. They're not reading reasoned analysis about the economy or the election or the stakes of the election. They're seeing bits and pieces and clips, and they are seeing content that is driven to them. It is given to them by algorithms that are fueled off of rage. The engagement is driven by anger, and the more angry people are, the more they react, the more content they're given that's going to evoke that sort of reaction. And it has nothing to do with the news or with educating the public. It is a form of entertainment, and a very toxic one. And to use that as a channel for gaining information and for making important decisions like for whom we should vote, it's incredibly dangerous. I will say that Olivier is correct that, fortunately, Donald Trump really does not have the great track record that some people think that he does. Not only has he lost his party's midterms when he was in office, but if you look at the track record of candidates he's endorsed since leaving office, they will win their primary, their Republican primary, because they have the Trump seal of approval. But, to Olivier's point, when it comes down to the general election, that's when they lose every single time. So, on the one hand, Donald Trump, he's not as big of a cartoonish villain as we sometimes make him out to be in terms of his track record. On the other hand, it is a very dangerous place we're in right now, where people do not even remember 4 years ago when people were dying en masse in this country from COVID, where we were rationing bottled water and toilet paper in American grocery stores, and where the economy was on its back. Joe Biden and the Democrats came in and fixed that, and people need to remember what really had happened 4 years ago when Trump was in office, and just how much worse it can be should he come back into power.
We're almost out of time. Gregory Smith-Simon, just to ask you, what's the mood right now beyond New York City where you're sitting? Here in France right now, we don't know who's going to be the next prime minister. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of rage as well. What's the mood right now?
I think that there's a great deal of unease. I mean, this has characterized the last several years of the U.S. public discourse and around the world as well. I think that's still the case. I think one of the problems is that we need, in terms of this election, the expertise of people who are really good at winning elections. Joe Biden was really good at winning the last election. One of the problems you see is that the people with expertise are also using this moment to advance their agenda. Everybody's idea of who the smartest candidate is also their own personal favorite. You see that in James Carville throwing Kamala Harris under the bus. You see that in George Clooney endorsing somebody like Kamala Harris or Wes Moore, though I think that probably has a stronger hope for clinching the legitimacy Kamala Harris as a candidate. So I think that we have not gotten out of this long-term anxiety that, France, the UK, and the US, to take examples of the most recent elections, felt so acutely. I don't think it's going away anytime soon, and it's going to take a real concerted effort. It's interesting to see in some ways a debate among the loyal opposition about an incumbent candidate.
Gregory Smith-Simon, so many thanks for being with us from New York City. I want to thank as well Christian Hanley for being with us from Washington. Laure Mondeville, Olivier Burtin, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.